Today we have Dean Adams visiting us. I was just looking over his book that I think some of you may have been told about in Gigi's class and found it the first couple pages actually echoed a remarkably similar story I had of being a 17-year-old at the helm of a boat and crashing into something and having a skipper, I think it was me he wanted to throw overboard, not just the boat. Anyway, we're honored to have him here today to chat about halibut and halibut fishing management and some other things that tie in with that. I want to give you a cup.
Oh, thank you very much.
That's a very nice Huxley cup.
Appreciate it.
But I'll let you explain what you're here to tell us about today. And he's going to reserve a fair bit of time at the end for questions.
Yeah. So, I'm Dean. And the best way for me to get you guys grounded in this story is to start with my history in fishing, which started in 1972. I was 15 years old and got a job on my uncle's halibut schooner. And, here we go, this one. And it didn't take me very long to figure out that this was a very difficult job. I managed to stick with it despite the story that will come out in this book. I'm not going to go into the book at all, but I did. This is a PowerPoint presentation that I developed for University of Washington lecture. I've had it for quite a while, and this particular set of slides, and I was kind of surprised to find that this slide is in my original lecture. This is taken from a life raft, and at the end of my first fishing season, that's where I found myself. Nevertheless, I stuck with it. I fished for 35 years in Alaska, invested in fishing, and spent my whole professional career longlining for halibut and black cod in Alaska. And if I make some jumps, please interrupt me, because I haven't given this lecture for a while, and help me out, if you would. The halibut fishery is over 100 years old, the commercial halibut fishery, not counting, of course, the native fishery, using longline gear, which is poorly understood by the society. It's not like your salmon nets, your fish hooks, your trawl nets, and the crab pots. This is, I found that it's poorly understood. It's, I think, one of the better gear types for the environment. It has very little effect on habitat, and it is size selective for the larger fish, which is environmentally correct. You want to, the perfect fish to catch is the largest one, the one right before it dies, and obviously there are flaws in that, but fish hooks in the halibut fishery are large, and small fish cannot get their mouths around a big fishing hook. So I am very happy to do talks like this because I believe in the gear and the resource that I harvested for 35 years. And I'm going to go through a history of my experience starting in 1972 of the evolution of the fishery from a fisherman's perspective, and you'll see how the fishery became overcapitalized to an extreme degree. And when that happens, fishermen start screaming, and we call for change. And it took a long, long time. And from that was developed a system called the Individual Fishing Quota System, IFQ. And you'll hear me say IFQ a lot in this talk, and perhaps QS, which is quota share. And that's a component of the IFQ system. But let me start by giving a few slides, and I'm sorry, but sometimes there are too many slides, but I kind of like to give the history. It is a long history. This shows the native fishery, and then the earliest fisheries were sailing ships with longline gear, sending out dories. Let me make sure I push the right button here. These are dories stacked, nested in one another, and the dories would go out on the fishing grounds every day with 1 to 2 men in each dory with a small, well, it's all relative in longline fishing. You can fish up to 60 miles of gear in one day, depending on what kind of system you're using. But this would probably be more like a half mile of gear per 2-boat dory. And then the larger vessel would be the mothership, and that's where the fish are stored. In this case, they were salting fish in these days. The next era of longline in Alaska is the steamer era. Didn't last very long, and I'm not sure why, but coal-burning ships, still the dory fishery, and large boats to carry lots of men to go out in the dories. And then, ironically, the boats that I fished on the early part of my career before I got my own boat, and are still in existence, are these boats here, which were first powered by gas engines, very dangerous engine to have on a boat. Diesel is much safer, and those converted to diesel. And this is an example of the same boat that would have been converted from gas, the Lindy. As time evolved and the salmon fishery became larger in Alaska, salmon boats began to enter the fishery, and that's what's depicted by this boat on the bottom here. Top vessel is a Canadian vessel, and up until 1980, the Canadians were a large component of the Alaska fishery for halibut. And the bottom are gillnet boats from Bristol Bay or Alaska, the boats less than 32 feet by law, the gillnetters, and they could adapt their drums to hold longline gear as well. So over time, the fishery went beyond this schooner fleet, which is the boat depicted by the Lindy, if you remember that boat, into all these different kinds of boats. They could adapt to this gear. The gear was relatively cheap, and it just depended on the resource and the skipper's ability on how successful you would be. So the next slides I'm going to run through. This is the boat I spent 2 years on, 2 seasons, starting in 1972, my Uncle Jack's boat. I spent 5 seasons on the Northern with my Uncle Pete. I have a third uncle, and he had the schooner Attu, which is no longer in existence. It sank in a storm with no loss of life, thank God. So here's a very basic indication of the health of the halibut resource. When I started in 1972, the resource was at a lower state, would drop even further before I bought my boat. And then you can see some things happened in the 1990s. I was able to make good money as a teenager, and by the time I was 22 years old, I went in halvesies on this boat with my Uncle Pete, and 8 years later, I bought him out. And you can see that I invested at a pretty good time. It became a different matter of a competition at this point and I'll get into that in just a moment. Launch of the boat, and then I became part of I call it a club, nobody else calls it a club, but it's a small club of fishing vessel owners, and it sounds bigger than it is. Today it's probably only 30 boat owners, and when I was in the Fishing Vessel Owners Association, is probably closer to a max of 50, down to 45 by the time I retired. And these boats are all longline and generally owner-operator business model. And many of those boats were the old schooners, and there's still about, I would estimate, 15 to 20 of those boats still working effectively in the fleet. So owner-operator system, which depending on the fishery, salmon, a lot of owner-operators in salmon, crab in Alaska, less so, and then the trawl fisheries in Alaska, very little of the trawl fish are harvested by owner-operators at all. They're all corporate. While I'm in modern day terms, I'll mention the cod fishery in Alaska. The Pacific cod fishery is also another corporate fishery by and large with factory ships, freezer factory ships. Okay. I'm I don't know what I'm going to write about next, but this, to me, I don't know if it'd be a popular subject, but the Fishing Vessel Owners Association is a unique organization. It's small and extraordinarily effective and extraordinarily organized. And this core group followed the process of, through the overcapitalization, fishermen screaming, and through the system of federal fisheries management, which ended up in the IFQ system. And this little group was the flag bearer of change, and I'm not exaggerating anything. We had a vision, we had fishermen that were articulate, and we taxed ourselves to come up with the resources to send fishermen to meetings and representatives to meetings, and even hiring lobbyists, which we learned the hard way is critical in fisheries management. If you want to talk about that later, that's another story. So that kind of says it all for the Fishing Vessel Owners Association. The Fishing Vessels Owners Association serves two general purposes. Dealing with labor issues. There's a small union of fishermen in Seattle, almost specifically on our boats entirely, a very generous contract. And I'm not complaining about the generous contract. I think that's a fantastic way to be cooperative in business, is to pay your people well, and we did and do. But the other is political. The other issues are political, and they can range from harvesting issues, and then in the 80s we got more into environmental challenges. And I can't remember exactly what year, I'll just say late 80s, a fisherman was turned in by one of his crewmen for using dynamite to keep killer whales away from his gear. Killer whales are very effective on longline gear, particularly around Dutch Harbor and the Aleutian Islands. Greenpeace got wind of this, and they came down on us fast. And the Fishing Vessel Owners Association responded quickly. We didn't deny anything. We didn't reject anything. We just said, how can we work and satisfy you? And in this one small issue, we invited Greenpeace to come on our boats, and we took representatives out. They observed the problem, and in the case of the guy that came on my boat, I knew that if I went far enough west, I would stay away from killer whales and still catch lots of blackcod. And he did not see a killer whale for the whole trip. Nevertheless, we could show Greenpeace that we could deal with the problem. They backed off. The guy that did use the dynamite did go to jail, by the way. So, there we go. Bycatch. That's where you target a halibut and you catch a codfish. You can't determine what kind of fish is going to take the hook. I'm stumbling because this is more applicable to IFQ, and I'll save this issue for later. The bycatch issue was extraordinarily well solved by the IFQ system. Another environmental issue that even more than Greenpeace, the whole community, was Seabird bycatch. And this was primarily a factory fishery for cod in Bering Sea. Nevertheless, 2 short-tailed albatrosses were killed and observed by federal observers on these boats in the Bering Sea. And that was the threshold where action would be taken. And so FVOA and myself personally, we got involved. And I was a student at University of Washington at the time as well, and designed a Seabird bycatch mitigation system. It wasn't my idea. I just hosted where they set up the protocols for the research on my boat. But it turned into a program that I'm very proud of. It saved thousands and thousands of birds, not just the short-tailed albatross over the year, but a system was designed copying what the Japanese had done with their longline boats that protects the gear as it's being set into the ocean and keeps the birds from being able to attack the hooks before they sink down to the bottom. Those systems are in place on all the longliners in Alaska, and they're very effective. So my point is, there are several points, but this small little organization in Seattle has been very effective in dealing with a lot of things. And my one message that I'd like to leave you with is to recognize the importance of responsible organizations. So, overcapitalization. Let's see. Limited entry. Now I have a sheet here. I was going to say that IFQ system took 15 years to from the first screaming fisherman to when it was finally put into place. But this shows more like 25 years, this timeline I found. Nevertheless, it took a long time for the first call for change to happen. And I'll go through a few slides here that show how it was dealt with. The first form of this is why I identify as the first form of limited entry in the halibut fishery in Alaska, is we kick the Canadians out. Canada leaves halibut grounds after 57 years. It was, in terms of legislation, it was clean. In terms of dealing with a problem, it was effective. They caught a significant portion of the annual catch in Alaska. And they had nowhere to run to complain. It was just a slam dunk deal. It was, and in retrospect, it was, if you're going to benefit fishermen, you might as well benefit the fishermen in your own country and on the fishing grounds that belong to your country, and let the Canadians out. So that took care of part of the problem, but nevertheless, the abundance of halibut increased, and the ease of catching them increased along with that. When things get easier and you're making money, more people become interested. And it was more than a straight line. It was a, let's see. It looked more like this. So from 1972, when I started fishing, number of boats skyrocketed, number of people involved, the amount of effort along with it, and the number of days of fishing in the halibut fishery just plummeted to, in the Gulf of Alaska, to just 1 day one year, and then 2 days the next year. And I'll try to go through all of the problems related to that. So I hope that graph shows you a lot. It's called overcapitalization. It was extreme. The frenzy that's related to the pressure on fishermen to extract their annual income in 24 hours in the Gulf of Alaska. We had a relief valve as the Seattle fleet, the fleet that I belong to, the small fishing vessel owners fleet. We're known for traveling, and instead of harvesting outside of Kodiak, Seward, Sitka, Juneau, Ketchikan, we were travelers, and every year I would personally go out to the very end of the Aleutian Island chain, right up to the Russian border. It's a long trip, but there are halibut and blackcod out there. If we didn't make what we needed to do for our annual income to support the boat and families, we would travel. And the boats were good for traveling, and it was a culture that we were accustomed to. Okay. I'm going to go back here. You can kind of try to get a grasp. This is more of a table indication of the frenzy for fish. Okay, that's covered. So here we go. The 4 choices. So when it was really evident that the economics of fishing were deteriorating, the level of wastage was extraordinary, with thousands of boats, thousands of people on the sea all at the same time. With the longline gear, essentially a basket weaving was being created with line on the ocean in certain highly productive areas, which there are several in Alaska all over the place. But you just start having boats stringing out long lines, and pretty soon you have a basket weaving. And you just have to realize that if you're pulling up the line and trying to get your gear back with fish on it, and there are fish on it, you're going to have this entire web of gear to deal with, and you're not going to get your gear back. The deal with that is you're not only going to lose your gear. What happened was millions of pounds of fish were left on the bottom because there was all this unretrievable gear due to this horrible mess, and literally millions and millions of pounds of halibut were left to die on the hooks. The managers knew all about it, the fishermen knew all about it, but when you have what was called the Derby opening, nicknamed the Derby opening, that was a fact of that style of management. So 4 choices: status quo, just keep plugging along, having waste. License limitation, like the many salmon fisheries in Alaska, their systems went into effect in the 70s. That's very simple. You just limit the number of boats. In some cases, you limit the fishing power of the boats by making them small, limit the length of their gill nets. But it's all about boats. A license for a boat, and the managers figure out how many licenses to issue. And they're a little bit flexible. You can have a bypack on license limitation, but still quite fixed. The fishermen are allowed to become more clever, use better electronics, and over time, the increased fishing power, even though the numbers are fixed, has to be dealt with in some way. Then individual fishing quotas. So the metaphor that's always used for IFQs is the pie. And the status quo, you can still use a pie. The pie is the resource of halibut available to be harvested every year. In the status quo derby fishery, you'd have thousands of people diving into the pie. And there'd be pie sloshing over the edge onto the floor. People would crash into each other. People were dying, actually. I haven't mentioned that yet. I'll just go from what I remember is that roughly on average, I think about 3 people on each 24-hour opening would die from accidents, or if that 24-hour opening was scheduled on a day that coincided with a storm going through the Gulf of Alaska, horrible things happened. And you had a lot of inexperienced people out there. So the pie. So in New Zealand, I'm pretty familiar with the system down there. I'd visited New Zealand several times, still do. And I got to know the IFQ system down in New Zealand quite well because I gravitate toward the fishermen. I want to see how this unusual system is working. This is where the pie is cut into slices. And where the slices are cut are typically based on your historical production in the fishery. If you have a history of large catches, you'll get a large slice of the pie. If you have a short history and little catch, you'll have a very small slice of the pie. One of the advantages of the IFQ system is that everybody gets a slice. How cool is that? Whereas if you have a license limitation system, you really have to cull a lot of people and a lot of boats before you come up with a system that's effective. In the Fishing Vessel Owners Association, our little club, I became a proponent of the IFQ system because I knew that the fishermen that would be culled from the license limitation, like salmon, would be primarily the Alaska fishermen. A lot of new entrants in Alaska. The population of Alaska tends to have a higher turnover, and I explain that by the weather and the darkness in the winter. And the bottom line was, in those days, the boats with the least production and the least history were primarily Alaskan. And I knew that that was not politically possible compared to other options where, like the IFQ system, everybody gets a slice of the pie. The license limitation system would, if I had a choice, personal choice, I'd probably take the license limitation if I got a license, of course. Key question there. It's competitive, it's a little more exciting, mostly competition. I recognized after the IFQ system came into effect in 1995 that the competitive feature of the open access fishery was lost. And with license limitation, there's still competitive nature in fishing. As if you're familiar with the Bristol Bay fisheries, those are very competitive. And then, honestly, I don't even know what annual fishing allotments are. I think that might be related to more like a resource rental system where you can bid on the ability to harvest fish, and kind of like timber, I believe, is managed that way, where the timber companies lease federal forests and pay a lease. Let me see. There's a lot to describe in this IFQ system, and I want to make sure you guys are grounded with it. Going back to New Zealand, not only was I studying New Zealand, the Alaska fisheries managers were studying New Zealand as well. The key difference between New Zealand and what was eventually established in Alaska in 1995 was that in New Zealand, anybody could own a piece of the slice, or a slice of the pie, and you could own a piece of the slice. Once the system becomes established, the slices can be sliced and diced and combined. In the case of New Zealand, there was very little restriction on consolidation. And anybody could own a slice of the pie. And I don't know if it still exists, but there was a mutual fund in New Zealand, publicly traded, that was a quota share fund. That would be like an ETF. If you're familiar with ETFs, it's a financial instrument you can buy shares of. You can invest in Mexico or Taiwan, and they'll have companies from Mexico and companies from Taiwan in these ETFs. You could buy a financial device that was based on your ownership in a fishery, and that was in New Zealand. That's how wide open the ownership was. And I get passionate about that because the effect of that is that what goes along with that is the owners of this right to harvest want income, and that is a lease. And in New Zealand, when I studied it, I discovered that that the owners of the right were extracting from the fishermen, from the catch of fish, was getting to be over 50% of the value of the fish landing on the dock. So in those days, halibut was about $2 a pound. You'd give up half of it to somebody owning a mutual fund in a downtown office hour in Auckland, New Zealand, if you apply it to the New Zealand system. And that didn't sit well with me. And it didn't sit well with many people in Alaska. The owner-operator model of business in the halibut longline fishery is well established. It's a style of fishing that is best served by an owner-operator. I think natural economic forces would show it otherwise if the core group of owners were not owner-operators. So in the development of the Alaska system, it was decided to keep the owner of the boat as the owner of the fishing right, and to take it one step further, the owner would have to be on board with one caveat. So I'll go through that one more time. The owner of the fishing boat was granted the slice of the pie in the initial allocation of the pie, in the initial cutting up of the pie. And then that owner had to be on board. And the caveat is, because the fleet was not 100% owner-operator, they let a provision for what's called hired skippers. And that allowed the owners to stay on shore as they had been and let hired skippers run the boat, and everything runs along merrily. Okay, and then the leasing thing. So then you have owners of quota that are allowed to stay on shore. And sometimes it takes me to wrap my head around this. What ended up happening was that and these are called initial allokees, or the people that got the initial allocation. In other words, the second generation owners of these fishing rights would have to be on the boat. And that's the good part of what Alaska designed. In the meantime, there's a lot of money being taken away from the fishermen and put into people on shore. And in some cases, people that don't even own boats. And that gets under my skin because boats are expensive to keep up and operate and keep safe. And I like to see the boats retaining the income as well as the fishermen. It's important to the safety of the economic viability of the industry. Now I'm kind of jumping ahead there, but there was a lot of press. It took, I say 15 years for the quota system from when they really got serious in trying to design something. The quota system really didn't become a serious consideration until the last 5 years in the debate. So, I've stressed 1995, that was the turning point. And one thing about creating a pie with slices is it turns into a market system for the actual slices and portions of slices. You can literally buy 1 pound of fishing rights. You can cut it up that small, and actually smaller than that if I think about it, because there's that's too complicated. I'll just stick with a pound. They're called quota shares, and it's a varying system based on how the quota shrinks and expands. It's a conversion ratio that equates to a pound. They establish the ratio every year, and that's the market. They still sell quota by the pound in the marketplace, but it fluctuates. New Zealand, if you're following me, New Zealand made it a fixed system without an expansion and contraction. And I don't even know why they did this, but they ended up having to buy back quota because the fisherman was saying, hey, you dropped the quota, I have this right to catch it. What's the deal here? And the government ended up buying back millions of dollars worth of fishing rights from the New Zealand fishermen. And since then, they've switched to an index system that fluctuates. Okay, so what are the results in from the IFQ system? We'll try this thing out here. Can you read that in the back? The important features of this are the left, and I've highlighted the important features in the IFQ column. So we have allocation conflicts. That's between other fisheries and gear types, no direct effect. But all of the results of the IFQ system, with the exception of discard mortality, and I'll explain that, went into the positive side. And I've highlighted enforcement, administration, and fishermen's fees. The administration of the IFQ system is expensive. However, they did establish a tax that goes right to the owner of the fishing rights. So that balances out, and they do adjust that accordingly. So that's a net result of enforcement, administration, and then a fee to the fisherman. The rest of the issues, gear conflict, that's where I was talking about the web of gear on the ocean bottom. The dead loss related to the gear conflict. Bycatch loss, which relates to incidental fish that you catch. The incidentally caught fish in the IFQ fisheries is retained at a much greater rate than before, particularly with the black cod fishery, which was turned into an IFQ system at the same time. And for the purpose of this talk, I'm talking almost entirely about halibut. But concurrent with halibut was another pie system for the sablefish fishery. And the benefit in the IFQ fishery was we could keep both species while we were on the ocean. Before that, if we were fishing halibut, we'd have to chuck the black cod back in the ocean that we caught incidentally, and vice versa. We're fishing for black cod, we'd have to put the halibut. And there's mortality and loss related to fish that are hooked in these situations. So it's a complete waste of resource. That's bycatch loss. Now, discard mortality has a better known name, which is called Highgrading. And usually with fish, almost entirely, the larger the fish, the more valuable, with exception of maybe the 300-400 pound, or you don't catch 400 pounders that often anymore, but let's say 300 pound halibut. Sometimes the market, if you get too many of those into the market, they become a burden on the market, and you'll see a price drop for the largest fish. But across the board, especially with black cod and any other species that I can think of, the larger the fish, the more valuable it is, and the more return that you're going to get in meat and food from each fish. Discard mortality refers to the human behavior, human response to harvesting your slice of the pie, and say you got into a bunch of small fish, and human nature would say that you would want to get rid of those small fish and wait for the big ones to come aboard and collect just the big fish. That's called Highgrading. And it says increase of discard mortality, increase of Highgrading. I would argue a little bit with that, basically because the fish are it takes a lot of effort. You have to travel out on the open ocean. You have to live on the ocean, deal with the environment. And if I catch a small fish that's worth 80% of a large fish, it's like, it's not worth it. I'm keeping that small fish. Having said that, there is a forced law to discard small fish, in effect, in the halibut fishery. They don't want the juveniles to be retained. So a 10-pound fish, and less, smaller than 10 pounds, you're required to throw back in the ocean. And the rationale for that is only 18% of those, 18% by weight of those fish die. So you're still getting a vast majority of the fish returning to the ocean bottom and living and growing. In black cod fishing, there isn't a minimum size limit. So discard mortality, debatable. In excessive harvesting capacity, done. You have a pie. It's up to the fishermen to determine how much effort and capitalization they want to throw into their right to harvest. And product wholesomeness. That goes right along with quality. The quality of the fish that you get, and you've seen it in the marketplace. You see halibut in the marketplace for 8.5 months a year now. It used to be that you'd see halibut in the marketplace depending on the openings in Canada, the fishing openings in Canada and the US. You just see halibut sporadically. And it'd probably stay in the cooler in the grocery store longer. In other words, if it was fresh and we've got it, let's do what we can with it in the marketplace and stretch it out in the cooler. Today, and the most important feature of the pre-IFQ fishery, the Derby fishery, was that up to 21 million pounds of halibut was hitting the dock at the same time. You can't get that into the system in a reasonable fashion. It's a bottleneck. It gets plugged. It's a product that spoils, so what do? You freeze it. And halibut does not freeze well. Consequently, the value of the fish, as soon as you put it in the freezer, diminishes. Tremendous economic loss there. And the result today is you go into your what do you have here, Hagen's, and you see fabulous halibut all the way up until November 15th. And then I think they're starting the season in March these days, March 1st. So you have this wonderful halibut. And even though it's expensive, I like to have a little piece every now and then. It's wonderful. It's just like what I ate when I was on the boat. Safety, I've mentioned that. Injuries and deaths greatly improved. I was just told some statistics that were, and I can't repeat them, sorry, but they're dramatic. It was like us turning a light switch off. The change was significant. And economic stability, that economic boost would be the better way to put that. The value of the resource doubled within 1 year in the marketplace. And boy, I'm going to have to really, I'm almost done. This rural community development, this is an old table, and I'm kind of jazzed to see that one there because one of the interesting byproducts of the whole IFQ system is the rural community development, and that is the native groups in Alaska had to be satisfied in this whole process politically, and recognized that early on that they needed compensation, they needed fish rights, and in the case of the Aleutian Islands in the Bering Sea, they got between 10 and 15% of the resource. And I'll save that for a little bit just to make sure I get everything. Okay, here we go. Cool. Well, everything got so groovy in the halibut fishery and the black cod fishery that the Marine Stewardship Council, which is an international body, we didn't go to them for certification. They came to us because they heard about all the advances that we'd made in protecting the resource, reducing waste, et cetera, a responsibly managed fishery. And the little group that I belonged to until I sold my boat 5 years ago, We spent over, I think it was about $160,000. It costs money to get certified, and a body, an organization, or a government, in this case of salmon, the state of Alaska sponsored the certification for the salmon fisheries in Alaska. Our little group stepped up. The fisheries were studied intensively by scientists hired from around the world, independent scientists, to study the management, and the certification of halibut and blackcod was determined to be sustainable, and still is today. And I know just as of 2 weeks ago, the recertification, they have to go through review. I forget the term, I think it's 3 years. We have to go through a recertification process. And that was just happening here in Seattle recently, just 2 weeks ago. So that's all good. We like sustainability, especially in a natural resource like that. Okay. One reason I'm curious to see what's going to happen with this recent research certification is something's going on in the ocean, and what this means, and what you're looking at, the declining red line, can be easily translated to this. Imagine that, I'm a parent, imagine that when I was 15 years old, I weighed 150 pounds. And what this says, with no exaggeration, is that my 15-year-old weighs 75 pounds. So how would you feel about that? You weighed 150 pounds when you were 15 years old, and a generation later, and I'm extrapolating because fish do things differently than we do reproductively, but at a given age, the size of a halibut has decreased by 50%. And what goes along with that is, in the scientific world, it's called fecundity. Now, there's all sorts of effects, but the reproductive ability of a fish that's half as big as the other is more like exponential rather than mathematic. A big change. And along with that, this is the same graph I showed you earlier, and I modified it to do the modern number for 2012 harvest. You can see what's going on out there. The reason I showed you the previous graph first is it's easy to look at that and just say, oh my God, the fishermen are destroying the resource. We certainly harvest from it, but the resource is studied intensively, has been for a long time. There are 3 different sources of data that are very long data sets for halibut. The science is robust. The bottom line is the fish are small. I'd say that I had 8 reasons to retire from fishing, and I retired when the catch was up in that blue level there, but I did see the small fish coming into the fishery, and that disturbed me. Just didn't seem right, as would a parent with seeing their kid being half as big as you were when you were the same age. It is disturbing. And by the same token, you know, I was on the ocean for 35 years, and you don't really hear about it, but there are these major shifts that take place out there in organisms. And in one case, a shift in the massive ocean current, which is called the Alaska Gyre. One year I went up there to fish black cod, and the gyre was moving in the opposite direction. I go, you know, that's not possible. I mean, the gyre always goes counterclockwise in the North Pacific. And here it was going backwards. And I relied on that characteristic in the technique that I was fishing. So it was like, damn, that's not going to work anymore. But in terms of organisms, massive shifts that I've seen, the first would be the Solaster starfish were in incredible numbers in the 70s, and they would move on top of our hooks, and we would catch them on the hooks, and we'd have to swing them and get them off, thousands of them. Another bloom that I saw over the course of a couple of years were I think it's called the lion's mane jellyfish, the one with the long stinging tentacles. Our gear was stained red from the tentacles, and we got stung, constantly from the tentacles swinging in our faces and our eyes and everything. I'll never forget that. And the other one that I remember is Salps, and that's another jelly-like organism. It's a very odd part of the natural world, and I don't know how to describe them, but they are they're not jellyfish, but they're a jelly-like. But over the course of a few years, they were just everywhere in the North Pacific. So we try to think that sustainable, sometimes we confuse it with stability. And I'm not making excuses here, but you can't explain very directly the decrease in size of halibut with fishing effort. It points more to a shift that's going on in the ocean. You could say that prey are being removed by fishermen and other fisheries, but frankly, that's hard to argue. So anyway, I have talked about a whole lot of stuff, and I really hope that I haven't confused you. We have a little bit of time for questions. This I dug up. This goes back to the regional community organizations. And I mentioned the 10 to 15% of the resource that was granted to the native corporations in Bristol Bay and the Aleutian Islands. They've been very successful at managing the leasing of these fishing rights, and they've made a heck of a lot of money doing it, which is great. And this has really caught me off guard because I didn't have my ear to the ground for a couple of years while I was writing my book, and I went back to check in with my organization and see what's going on politically because I find this stuff fascinating. And he rattled off, how the catch was dropping and all these other things. Observer program was changing, and then he was silent. He goes, "Oh, did you hear about Ocean Beauty?" And I go, "What?" "Well, the native corporations bought half of Ocean Beauty." Well, this is a massive fish processing company with several different plants throughout Alaska. And I just went, wow, talk about a social change in the fishing business. So didn't expect that one. And they are taking it one level further and demanding that they stay in a tax-free status, which they enjoy in other businesses. So, you look at business margins and profit margins in business, and you take tax angle out of it, and it's like, wow, that's a huge advantage. So I just throw this one in at the end. It's going to be a fascinating twist. I really like to see the natives get an advantage up there. They've been, it's tragic what I've witnessed, and I mentioned that in my writing, and this is it's definitely in the positive direction for them. I apologize if I have confused you, and we have a few minutes for questions.
Well, I'm a little confused about the IFQ system as far as the pie.
Yeah.
Who's deciding how much of it is? Do you have like a tonnage at a season that is proclaimed ahead?
You mean the initial allocation, how it was sliced?
Well, no, the actual size of the pie. Is that simply however much the various harvesters can get out of the system?
Yeah.
You're allocated a percentage of the total catch for a season?
That's where the index, the quota shares fluctuate. It's not just a poundage that you buy, it's an index within that converts into a poundage. So the pie actually fluctuates. And in the case of halibut, it's shrunk by 50%. And that has put enormous pressure on the people that invested into buying pieces of the pie. They've done their calculations on the market. The sellers of the quota did their calculations on what they extrapolate what the right is worth. And all of a sudden, in the course of 5 years, it's just kind of like this. And the numbers aren't adding up for the people that invested. That's a problem for the new owners of the rights. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
I just wanted to go back to something you had pretty early in your presentation when you were first showing the first graph about kind of where I think it was the poundage literally of halibut being brought out. And I was going to ask, because you see that huge spike kind of in the 80s and 90s before it started going back down, but what really led to that spike back in the 70s? But that was all it looked like, almost like a double.
That was bizarre, frankly. In the early part of my career, we'd set miles of gear, a few thousand hooks, and we'd get, in the old days with 4,000 hooks, we'd get 2,000 to 4,000 pounds a day. And the fish were distributed small, medium, large, extra large. And what my perception was is that fish were coming out of the woodwork. And we cover the entire continental shelf. I mean, we sample it in our operation. So it wasn't like we were confused because where are these fish coming from? It's possible that they were on the continental shelf, and that's just a speculation of mine. The continental shelf goes down into the abyss, and later in my career, I would fish more of the continental shelf edge, fishing for blackcod, and I learned more about the continental shelf edge and halibut when I became a blackcod fisherman in the 1980s. I had to diversify into blackcod to keep my boat alive and the family's happy in my business.
But you don't think it doesn't look like it was related to anything you guys changed your practices or what you were using? It's almost just like a
No.
anomaly kind of?
No. And the bizarre part of it was that the component was there were older fish in the population. And that
wasn't the poundage going up more or less correlating with the overcapitalization with lots more boats?
No. That graph indicated the responsible harvest of the resource. It had nothing to do with effort.
That was predetermined by
Predetermined by quotas, an overarching quota. And that's the overarching quota, even though it's shaped like an arch, but it was established beforehand how much the quota was based on the survey, the ocean survey, catch and release studies, and I'm going to space on the third one right now, but 3 solid ways that fish are studied for abundance.
Could they have been changing their practice if they were getting better and better at surveying? Discovering fish?
Well, the science of surveying is very established, and the key is to stick with your methods. And I can assure you that the methods that the International Pacific Halibut Commission is the research body in charge of studying the resource. It's a binational Canadian-US body. And I did my master's in the Halibut Commission, and I know the place pretty well. And I had a survey, I bid on a survey and did one for them in the Gulf of Alaska in 1980-81, the winter of. And the key with surveys is just consistency. And the trouble is sometimes something will change. And that the big something is, in the case of halibut and blackcod, was in the mid-'80s, the fleet converted to a fish hook that is extraordinarily effective. And the scientists were incredibly frustrated because they had this beautiful data set. The longer your data set, the more robust statistics you can extract out of it. And then here comes along this circle hook versus a J hook. And the catch effectiveness of the circle hook is double. So they had to convert their science to try to understand what the circle hook meant. So they do side-by-side surveys with both hooks, and it was an awkward transition. You might try to blame mistakes on that, but you'd have a tough time. They did the best they could to try to make a conversion from one to the other. Let's see. Foreign, other than the Canadians, the foreign fishermen weren't allowed to fish for halibut with the establishment of the Magnuson-Stevens 200-mile Act, which went out to 200 miles. From that time, foreign fishermen were allowed in certain fisheries. Halibut, not. Black cod, yes. And I was witness to the last year that the Japanese in particular, they caught a lot of black cod in Alaska right up to, I'd say 1984. And it was, the policy was, is if the American fishermen were unable to or unwilling or to harvest the resource, that the foreign fishermen would be allowed to do it, which makes sense. And in '84, with the burgeoning numbers and participating in halibut overflowing into the black cod fishery, the Japanese were told, sorry, it's over. And then it turned into a 100% American fishery at that point. Answer your question? Yeah.
So was there much of a reduction in the size of the fleet after the IFQ system was put in place? It seems like it would make sense that it would be.
As I was driving up here today, I was thinking that I should have some numbers for you, and I'll just have to wave my arms on that one. I'm sorry. But in the case of halibut, it went from thousands of boats and consolidated maybe to 1,000, but I would say easily a 25% or a 75% reduction in numbers of boats. And I'm sorry I don't have that number for you. The black cod fishery is smaller in terms of boats, and not so much anymore in quota, because the black cod quota has remained stable, which is a mystery to me. I'm expecting the black cod to get smaller too, because they're both right bottom feeders, and I'm kind of wondering how that will work out. So sorry I don't have those hard numbers for you. But consolidation, speaking to consolidation, one of the key features, and I'm glad you made me think of that, is that in Alaska, in the 2 IFQ fisheries, halibut and black cod, there is a restriction on how much can be consolidated. And it's 1/2 of 1%. One person, and it has to be a person, can only own 1/2 of 1% of the fishing rights of the pie. And in the case of black cod, sablefish, it's 1%. And there are way more than 200 halibut fishermen and way more than 100. But it was recognized they didn't want people to come in and consolidate. In New Zealand, the consolidation is ridiculous. Yeah, you have companies that own 25% of national resources and greater. It's pretty crazy. Black sweater and then the red.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, because you described, I forget what the first system's called, but where they basically just have this one day to go in and fish.
That's called season area closure management.
Okay, so who came up with that, and why? Like, I mean, it seems like a pretty bad policy idea, and like, where did that come from? I guess from like what branch or what state? And then why did it? I think you said it took like 15 years really to reverse that. Why did it take so long when it was pretty clear? That's almost worth a book right there. But season area closure is like, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like the deer season. It includes everybody that wants to do it, and it's just a matter of how long the season's open and what area you're going to harvest. The reason it took so long, and the reason I say a book, because the governing body for federal fisheries in Alaska is called the Council. It's the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council, NPFMC. And that is comprised of 12 members and 1 non-voting included in that. 6 seats are Alaskan, and I can't repeat the out of Alaska numbers, but you have 2 seats from Washington, I do know that. And then you have Idaho and Oregon in there as well. Coast Guard seat, I think that's a non-voting seat. Anyway, you have a majority Alaskan component to the council, and the Magnuson Act gets revisited on a time frame as well,
And that's one of the issues that comes up every time, is to redistribute the voting structure of that council so that Alaska doesn't swing everything. You know, you could argue that, well, it's their resource out their front door and it's their local economies that are impacted the greatest, so give them a majority on the council. So anyway, a lot of dynamics on the council process.
Finish up here.
Oh, sorry.
People can keep asking questions one-on-one, but I want to make sure people
Can you go back to the slide of the drop-in perspective?
Okay.
I'll look at it. But my question is, I'm used to the license limitation system. How does the IFQ enforcement work? You've got your quota for the year, your quota for the year.
Yeah.
And then is it enforced when you sell to the processor? How does that work?
They use a magnetic card system for recording landings. Enforcement, one thing I didn't mention, and this is really important, I'm sorry, well, again, I'm glad that you bring up this question. The cost of getting into this business is extraordinary now. Millions of dollars to duplicate the business that I once had. It's just a function of how much you can make and from that right, and it's very mathematical. When I started fishing, it was a matter of the fishing was more difficult to find fish, but nevertheless, I don't think I even had to spend a dime on a fishing permit. Ironically, my crewman had to have a fishing license from the state of Alaska. No, I had to pay, I think I paid $100 for my fishing license, my commercial fishing license when I first started. That's true, the state of Alaska. In other words, in terms of the big picture, almost nothing. And now it's millions of dollars. In other words, my experience can't be duplicated. There's no way I could have raised that kind of money when I was 22 years old. You asked a little bit different twist on that question. I don't know if that answered it. Okay.
All right. Well, I'm sure Dean will be around for a little bit to chat with people one-on-one, but thanks a lot for coming in today.
Yeah. All right.